Senji Muramasa, also known as Sengo Muramasa, demonic swordsmith and Castoria's grandpa. But what about the Muramasa of Fate Grand Order? How well does he compare to his historical and mythical counterpart? And what grade would I give his depiction? Let's find out. Before we go any further, we need to talk about names. Senji Muramasa is sometimes called Sengo Muramasa, and there seems to be some uncertainty as to which was his actual name. It relates to how using certain kanji characters can sometimes have different meanings or pronunciations, which is usually something that a person can correct when there is confusion. But, as we will get into more later, there is very little known about the real Muramasa, and so whether he called himself Senji or Sengo, we just don't know for sure. Sengo seems to be the name most commonly used when talking about him. For my part, I'm going to largely stick to calling him Muramasa so I don't have to deal with this. Anyway, let's continue. Muramasa is a saber class servant, which Muramasa himself takes issue with from the very beginning when you first meet him in Shimosa. The reason why is that Muramasa is a swordsmith rather than a warrior. Indeed, he's not normally someone who would be summonable as a servant at all, and so the Muramasa we get is actually a pseudo-servant, a being put into a mortal's body, with the resulting servant being a blend of that being and the host's body. In this case, Muramasa is put into the body of Shiro Emiya, and as we know from Fate Stay Night, Shiro is all about swords and makes use of them quite extensively in every route of that story. My theory is that it is the blend of Muramasa being a swordsmith, and Shiro having his own close connection with swords, that explains why Muramasa is a saber. Interestingly though, Muramasa also has the territory creation skill, something you normally see on casters. Muramasa's take on this is to basically allow him to set up a forge for his smithing, allowing him to create the weapons he uses. So when it comes to his class, Muramasa doesn't really have a class that suits him since he was a swordsmith rather than a warrior. But by becoming a pseudo-servant with Shiro, a character who also has a close connection with swords, Muramasa ends up being a saber. At least, the one we can summon ends up being a saber. There is also the Muramasa that appears in story as one of the disciples of the foreign god. In this form, Muramasa has been turned into an alter ego by having aspects of other beings added to his spirit origin. So what identities have been added to Muramasa? Well, there are two. The first is Haldr, a Norse god who killed his fellow god Baldur, part of the series of events leading up to Ragnarok. Baldur was said to be all but invulnerable to harm, but with the help of the god Loki, Haldr would fire a mistletoe arrow at Baldur, the one thing that he was weak to. In other words, a being that has killed gods has been added to Muramasa's spirit origin, a talent he makes use of quite dramatically in Olympus. The other entity attached to Muramasa is not specified, but, well, I'm going to save the rest of this conversation for when I get to his noble Phantasm. Getting into his character design, Muramasa is actually the first pseudo-servant I have covered thus far, taking on the appearance of Shiro Emiya. Now initially, this character design was just a fancy craft essence image for the CE limited 0 over, like how Rin is on the CE formal craft or Sakura is on the CE imaginary around. Initially, the CE was meant to depict a Shiro who had matured into being a proper mage, but when Muramasa made his first appearance in Shimosa, they decided to use this image of Shiro they designed for the limited 0 over CE for his first ascension form. Moving up from here, the illustrator says that Muramasa's second ascension is meant to represent the character during his height as a swordsmith, while the third ascension is meant to be Muramasa as a grandfather. This older Muramasa has a close resemblance to Emiya, the future version of Shiro who becomes a servant, so there is that further connection with his host body. Really, the whole of Muramasa's design is full of references to Shiro. In Shimosa, Muramasa muses that perhaps Shiro is a descendant of his, or maybe just someone with a similar sort of personality, and that these may be the reasons why Shiro's body was chosen as the host for him. When you look at his animations, you get a blend of both Shiro and Muramasa. When he uses his skills or attacks against the enemy, sometimes Muramasa will do something smithing related like hammering a sword, or even to hit the enemy with the hammer. But for the other skills and attacks, he seems to be making use of Shiro's projection magic, since his swords disappear after hitting the enemy, and then a new one appears in his hands for the next attack. Not to mention the fact that Muramasa's MP has a quite obvious visual similarity to the MP Unlimited Blade Works. Now this is the first pseudo-servant I have covered, but this is making me wonder, are all the other pseudo-servants full of these references to their host body? I know Ishtar does with her gem use, or Summer Kama's MP having those shadow giants appear, but let's just say I'm interested to see how this plays out when it's time to get to the other pseudo-servants. Overall, Muramasa I'd say has a pretty good design that makes references to him being a swordsmith, and blends that together with elements from Shiro Emiya. I quite like it. Moving into a skill set, Muramasa's first skill is Tamashi Mono. which increases his arts card, buster card, quick card, and star gather rate for a single turn. Oh, and it's also a star bomb. This skill name refers to testing out a freshly forged sword, to make sure that it is sufficiently sharp and sturdy enough for proper use. Naturally, this makes lots of sense for a swordsmith like Muramasa, and is a hint why, despite not being a warrior, he at least knows a thing or two about swinging a sword. However, while that could end the discussion right here, you may have noticed something about this skill, namely that it is pretty much a copy of the skill Projection found on Emiya, the future version of Muramasa's host body, Shiro Emiya. In other words, it is not just in appearance that Shiro is influencing the servant Muramasa, but also in the skills he wields as well. Digging even deeper into this, Projection is the skill that Shiro makes use of in order to create copies of swords that he witnesses, whether that be Kansho and Bakuya, Caliburn, or the jeweled sword of Zelrech. These were only copies of the originals and were prone to breaking, but they still worked well enough. Now, what would happen if you combined Shiro's ability to use Projection to create copies of swords, and combined that with the fine knowledge of swords that a swordsmith like Muramasa has? I imagine that Muramasa making use of Shiro's Projection magic results in vastly better quality weapons than anything Shiro did. To me, this is actually the explanation why exactly Muramasa is such a powerful servant despite not being a proper warrior. He is making use of the talents of his host body, mixing them with his own expertise, and so we get a combination that is much stronger than either Shiro or Muramasa alone could ever be. Basically, Muramasa found the perfect host body for himself. Muramasa's second skill is Karmic Eye, which applies Ignore Invincibility for a turn, increases the critical strength against enemies with Evade or Invincibility for a turn, and then finally increases his star drop rate and critical strength for 3 turns. This skill is said to be similar to Clairvoyance, but specifically for combat. Now, while you wouldn't expect a swordsmith like Muramasa to have such a combat-specific skill, the explanation given is that because Muramasa spent his life trying to forge a weapon worthy of the divine, he has acquired this exceptional talent. Something about how spending so much time trying to pursue things like destiny and fate gives him an edge when it comes to seeing other things too. Like when an opponent is using an evade or invincibility skill so Muramasa can painfully show them the error of their ways. Admittedly, I'm less sure about this one. It clearly is trying to create a link between this skill and Muramasa's plotline in Shimosa. I guess it still works. Feel free to debate this one. Lastly, Muramasa's third skill is Flame, which grants up to a 50% MP charge, as well as applying the Flame status, which allows him to get up to 10% MP charge whenever he uses a normal attack for 3 turns. This is meant to represent Muramasa's dedication to his craft, his extreme focus on making superb swords even if it might cost him his own life. Now, the real Muramasa was one of the best swordsmiths in Japanese history, but he also developed a reputation for madness and forging demonic or cursed swords. I'll say more about this later. So while this skill might be referring to that, I can't help but think of a certain scene in Lostbelts 6, the one where Muramasa effectively sacrifices himself in place of Artoria Castor in order to forge Excalibur. His body literally starts burning away as he works on the weapon, and yet he still manages to finish it, or at least as much as it can be done by him. In other words, this is our first solid hint that the Muramasa we summon might actually be Muramasa after the events of Lostbelts 6. One more thing, Muramasa has a little Easter egg in his passive skills, specifically the one called Sire's Ill Omen, which gives him extra damage against kings. I'll be saying much more about this later in this video, but it is said that Muramasa's blades are cursed, and specifically against the Tokugawa clan, the family that ruled Japan as shoguns from 1603 to 1868. But since we don't actually have any Tokugawas as servants in FGO, they decided to give Muramasa a bonus against kings instead.
神髄解明完成任務収束鍛造技法臨界メイドの土産に拝みやがれこれが俺のつむかり村正だ
Muramasa's noble phantasm is Sumukari Muramasa, whereupon he emerges in a burning field of swords, merges them all into one ultimate blade, and then unleashes it upon the foe, setting everything ablaze. This MP starts off by giving himself a 3-turn buff to his MP damage and arts card effectiveness, the arts card buff increasing with overcharge. He then removes enemy attack buffs, before finally doing heavy defense ignoring damage to all enemies. Okay, so there is a lot to unpack here. Let's start with the name. Sumukari Muramasa is the name of the ultimate weapon that Muramasa forges in the climax of the Shimosa story, using the naming conventions of weapons forged by Muramasa and his descendants. This is not a weapon the real Muramasa made, but rather the weapon he aspired to make during his life. Tsumukari is a reference to Tsumukari no Tachi, which is another name for the legendary Kusanagi no Tsurugi, the sword discovered by the god Suzano no Mikoto after he had slain the serpent Yamata no Orochi. It is the same weapon wielded by Ibukidoji, Yamato Takeru, and is one of the 3 sacred treasures held by the Imperial House of Japan, though the actual Kusanagi no Tsurugi is never allowed to be revealed due to its divine nature. It is a sword that is comparable to Excalibur in terms of its significance in Japanese lore, so it's kind of a big deal. In other words, Tsumukari Muramasa is, in effect, Muramasa creating his own version of this legendary weapon. As you might expect, a weapon of this caliber and divine heritage is way beyond a swordsmith like Muramasa to wield. Indeed, upon using it in Shimosa, he vanishes, his spirit origin unable to withstand him using a weapon meant for gods. This raises some questions about this being Muramasa's MP, and especially the way Muramasa is built for MP spamming in FGO. Shouldn't this be an Arash situation where using this MP should kill him? Well, this is where we get back to Muramasa's alter ego form, and the 2 divinities that have been added to his spirit origin. One is the Norse god Hodor, but the other is not specified. What if that other entity added to Muramasa's spirit origin was something capable of wielding Kusanagi? During Lostbelts 6, you can sometimes take the alter ego Muramasa as a guest party member. If you do, sometimes when you use his MP, he says a line referring to someone named Kushina Dahime. Who's that? Well, Kushina Dahime is the one that was rescued by Suzano when he killed the serpent Orochi, the serpent whose tail became the sword Kusanagi. Indeed, Kushina Dahime became Suzano's wife in exchange for him saving her. What if the second entity added to Muramasa's spirit origin as an alter ego was none other than Suzano himself? If that's the case, then that would make Muramasa someone able to wield a weapon like Kusanagi without it destroying his spirit origin. While this explains why his alter ego version is able to do this, what about his saber version? Well, we do have the paradox that the servant Muramasa came out 5 to 6 months before Avalon Lefay. Perhaps it is possible that the saber Muramasa we summon has been affected by his time as an alter ego. It would explain both his third skill and his ability to not only survive using this MP, but to spam it like a lunatic in arts farming teams, which is pretty much the ideal way to use Muramasa in-game. On another note, in my King Arthur video, I used 524 words to talk about Excalibur. Just now, for Tsumukari Muramasa, I used 584. Let that sink in for a moment. Muramasa's craft essence is continuation of what happens after, depicting a blade, notably without a handle, sitting in front of, it kinda looks like a shrine? I'm not sure. Based upon what is written in the CE's description though, it talks about legacy, of leaving something behind for the future. Indeed, he even talks about it being a potential family heirloom. The it in question is almost certainly the freshly forged sword depicted in the image, since Muramasa's blades actually were, and still are, passed down as family heirlooms in samurai clans. The text also states that even if Muramasa wasn't able to make the sword he wanted during his life, he at least left an enduring legacy behind, one that we will be talking about soon when we get to characterization. Anyway, this is a pretty good CE. Muramasa's Valentine CE is artisanal mochi, depicting some mochi, Japanese rice cakes, atop a hibachi, a Japanese brazier. Now, you might think that these mochi were cooked using this hibachi. It certainly looked that way to me at first glance, but that's actually not the case. Hibachi were used for heating up rooms in the days before modern appliances like heaters and air conditioning, only sometimes being used for heating up tea. Now, the word hibachi has become associated with a Japanese-style grill, but this is a North America thing. In Japan, these would be called shichirin instead, a charcoal grill specifically meant for cooking. Anyway, as for character significance, there really isn't anything specific to Muramasa here, but these are items he would have made use of in his own time period. I'll go ahead and say this works. And now for characterization, starting with a look into the story of Senji Muramasa. There is actually very little we know about the real Muramasa. We don't even know when exactly he lived. The oldest Muramasa sword we know of was made in 1501, and so at the very least he was born before that. He lived in Ise province in the Kansai region, and there were several generations of Muramasas who made swords there, with the last Muramasa blade seeming to be from the Kambun era, or 1661 to 1673. Muramasa swords have a very distinct appearance and are prized as being exceptionally sharp, though at the cost of their durability. As for what kind of person the original Muramasa was, well, the fact that we don't even know when the guy was alive is a pretty good hint that what people say about him is shrouded in myth rather than established fact. But what those legends say is that Muramasa was quite the scary individual, a swordsmith that was ill-tempered, violent, and prone to bouts of madness. It is said that these dark aspects of his personality were infused into the weapons that he forged, leading to those blades being cursed or demonic in nature. It was said that those who drew a Muramasa blade could not sheath it without it tasting blood of a worthy foe, or perhaps even its wielder. There are many stories told about people going mad or going on murder sprees while wielding these swords, such as the story of Sano Jirozemon, who in 1696 killed perhaps as many as 100 people in Yoshiwara, the red light district of Edo, what is today the city of Tokyo. Numerous kabuki plays staged during the 18th and 19th century tell other stories where someone wielding a Muramasa blade engages in some horrific act of violence, further cementing the reputation that the blades forged by Muramasa were cursed and drove its wielders to kill. But the most infamous legend about Muramasa blades has to do with the Tokugawa. Now, the Tokugawa clan was based in the province of Mikawa, and if you look at a map, you will notice that Mikawa is quite close to Ise province, the home of the Muramasa swordsmiths. And considering their reputation as exceptionally sharp blades, it probably shouldn't be a surprise that many samurai from Mikawa province would get themselves a Muramasa. Indeed, one of the branch families of the Tokugawa clan, the Owari Tokugawa, to this day possesses a Muramasa blade as an heirloom. But there are quite a few bloody incidents in the history of the Tokugawa clan that involve a Muramasa blade, specifically in relation to Tokugawa Ieyasu, the first Tokugawa shogun and the third of Japan's three great unifiers. Let's go through them. Matsudaira Kiyoyasu, the grandfather of Tokugawa Ieyasu, was murdered in 1535 by his retainer Abe Masatoyo. In 1549, Ieyasu's father, Matsudaira Hirotada, was stabbed by his vassal Iwamatsu Hachiya. In 1579, following the execution of his wife Lady Tsukiyama on suspicion of treachery, Ieyasu's eldest son, Matsudaira Nobuyasu, was forced to commit seppuku as well. In 1600, in the aftermath of his victory at the Battle of Sekigahara, Ieyasu himself would cut himself upon a spear while inspecting how it had pierced through the helmet and head of an enemy commander. In 1615, during the final battle of the Sengoku Jidai, the Battle of Tennoji, the famous samurai Sanada Nobushige, also known as Sanada Yukimura, wounded and nearly killed Ieyasu. Lastly, in 1634, a grandson of Ieyasu, Tokugawa Tadanaga, committed suicide while under house arrest by his elder brother, the shogun Tokugawa Iemitsu. In every single one of these incidents, a Muramasa blade was involved. Now, you could argue that all of these events involving someone from the Tokugawa family being wounded or killed by a Muramasa blade may just be a crazy coincidence. Muramasa blades wouldn't have been rare in this part of Japan. But with this many incidents, I suppose you can't really blame people for getting superstitious, and coming to believe that there was a curse linking Muramasa and the Tokugawa clan. Later, those who fought to overthrow the Tokugawa shogunate would actively seek out Muramasa blades, seeing them as a symbol of anti-Tokugawa resistance. Someone who tried and failed to overthrow the Tokugawa in 1651, a ronin named Yui Shosetsu, was said to have possessed a Muramasa. Another anti-Tokugawa figure said to have owned a Muramasa blade was Saigo Takamori, one of the leaders of the pro-imperial forces during the Boshin War that ended the Tokugawa shogunate, and whose later leadership of the Satsuma Rebellion would get loosely adapted into a Tom Cruise movie. Ultimately, whoever the real Muramasa truly was, it has been overshadowed by the sinister reputation his blades have acquired. They paint the image of Muramasa as a forger of cursed demonic swords that drive its wielders to kill, blades that seem to have a particular taste for the blood of the Tokugawa clan. After having looked into his backstory, the fact that we only really have myths and theories to go on in regards to what the real Muramasa was like, it leaves the door open for interpretation. What we get in FGO is not a bloodthirsty madman who creates cursed blades infused with his own foul nature, but instead we get a character who often acts like a grumpy old man, but at his core is a good person. As for what's going on with his weapons, the explanation given in Shimosa is that Muramasa is working towards creating an ultimate blade that reaches the realm of the divine, what would become his MP Tsumukari Muramasa. But since he hasn't yet been able to do that, the weapons he has been forging fall short of that, and he says that a weapon just short of the divine ends up being demonic. In other words, the story of Muramasa's cursed blades is explained as being his failures in his attempts to create something even better. We of course have no idea if this is how the real Muramasa thought, but as far as explanations go as to why Muramasa's blades were considered cursed or demonic, I'd say it's pretty neat. Anyway, Muramasa's first story appearance is in Shimosa, where he acts as an ally to Musashi, the protagonist, and the 2 orphans he is taking care of at his home. It is one of his failed demonic swords that allows Musashi to take down the heroic spirit swordmasters, and it is his home that is used as a base during the quest to defeat them. In the background, Muramasa continues working towards his ultimate goal, the divine sword that he sought to create in life. It is only at the very end of the Singularity that Muramasa realizes why he has been summoned to Shimosa, facing off against the corrupted Amako Sashiro at the demonic Onriedo Castle. With his ultimate sword completed, and taking advantage of the fact that Onriedo has the word Edo in it, the home castle of the Tokugawa shogunate that seems to be cursed by Muramasa's blades, he unleashes Sumukari Muramasa against the castle, cutting it in half and setting it ablaze. Since he is not a divinity capable of wielding such a weapon, Muramasa disappears after this. But this is pretty much the end of Shimosa anyway, so chances are he was going to return to the throne soon anyway. When we next meet Muramasa though, he is not an ally, but an enemy, having been summoned as one of the disciples of the foreign god. With that said, Muramasa is not exactly enthusiastic about this. He has to serve the foreign god because that's who summoned him, and servants cannot go against their master without serious repercussions, unless they can find a new one, of course. But because he has no passion for serving the foreign god, Muramasa tends to act like a disgruntled employee who is overly strict about carrying out his orders. Probably the best example of this happens in the Atlantic Lostbelt, where Muramasa is told to carry out 3 tasks: protect Prometheus Hephaestus, prevent Hephaestus from contacting Chaldea, and eliminate Chaldea. Muramasa decides to carry out 1 task at a time, and so decides to just keep focusing on his current task even when Chaldea runs into him. He's supposed to kill Chaldea, but says he won't until his other tasks are done, despite the fact that, Chaldea is right in front of him. Even when he finished his other tasks, Muramasa instead decides to leave, stating that if he fought Chaldea now he would probably lose, and that would prevent him from carrying out future jobs. In other words, Muramasa deliberately acts like a bad subordinate by putting off doing things he doesn't like. Then we get the events of Lostbelt 6, Avalon Le Fay. After Olympus was destroyed by Morgan, the foreign god sends Muramasa to eliminate her. Muramasa, being the overachieving employee that he is, decides to just walk into Morgan's castle, say he's here to kill her, and attacks. The sheer audacity of this allows him to catch both Barghest and Bavanshi off guard, but he is then thrown into the Great Pit by Melusine. After climbing his way out of the pit, he gets captured by slavers, is put up for sale at the auction in Gloucester, and is won by Chaldea and Artoria Castor. Despite still being an enemy, Muramasa decides to work with Chaldea and Artoria Castor, since it technically doesn't clash with his current job to kill Morgan. He blends in quite nicely with the party, with a particular highlight being his comedic relationship with Artoria Castor. It is also something of a meta role reversal. In Fate Stay Night, Shiro is the mage being protected by Artoria. In Lostbelt 6, Artoria is the mage being protected by Muramasa, who is in Shiro's body. Even after Morgan is defeated, Muramasa sticks around. He hasn't received any new orders to follow after all, and so he remains an ally even as Fairy Britain goes completely to hell. But when Artoria Castor journeys to Avalon to forge Excalibur, which would result in her death, Muramasa decides to step in and take her place, having at last found a job that he actually wants to do. Even if it costs him his life, Muramasa does it both to forge a divine weapon, which is kind of a big deal for a swordsmith, as well as allowing Artoria Castor to live a while longer. Oh, and it also gets him out of his contract with the foreign god, which is certainly a nice bonus. This may very well be the end of Muramasa's involvement in the main story, and perhaps even all of FGO. At least, I don't know of any future appearances he has made. But if this is the end of his part in the story, I'd say he's had a pretty good story arc. Starting off in Shimosa and achieving his dream of forging the ultimate weapon, having that accomplishment be part of what gets him summoned as a disciple of the foreign god, and yet despite being put into a position he clearly doesn't like, he ends up freeing himself, and doing so in a way that he finds fulfilling. Muramasa's story in FGO does make clear connections to his life as a swordsmith with a dark reputation, but then decides to create this whole story for him that makes his character so much more, kinda like with what we saw with Barghest and Bavanshi. In this regard, the lack of information about the real Muramasa ends up being a gift. It allows the writers to fill in the gaps and make something new that is both very interesting, and yet still manages to remain consistent with the legends. And now for the verdict. What grade would I give Senji Muramasa's depiction in Fate Grand Order? Well, you certainly can't argue that the designers were lazy with this one. There is so much to dig through when it comes to every aspect of his character, far more than I expected. The developers clearly put a lot of thought into the character and have made excellent use of him in the main story. But when it comes to what these videos are ultimately about, figuring out how accurate the FGO character is in comparison to their historical or mythical counterpart, this is very difficult. Because we have so few details about the real Muramasa, there's actually very little to compare. Everything we do know about the real Muramasa is mentioned and referenced in his skills, profile, and characterization. Pretty much the only things we can solidly say are inaccurate are the parts of the character directly tied to Shiro Emiya, such as his appearance and use of projection magic. The lack of knowledge we have about Muramasa has allowed the writers to fill in the gaps, and so give us a complete character that, even if aspects of Muramasa might not be true to the real person, we can't actually prove that they are untrue. This makes giving a grade for Muramasa way tougher than I expected. I can't give him an A+ because he's not bordering on perfect. It's quite clear that the bits he's taken from Shiro Emiya aren't correct. But for everything else, it's either accurate, reasonably explained, or we simply can't prove it one way or another. So while Muramasa is going to get a hit for the elements he takes from Shiro, otherwise, it's quite good. And so for a final grade, I am going to give Senji Muramasa, the demonic swordsmith, an A. If you would like to learn more about the person who beat up Muramasa during his assassination attempt, check out my video on Melusine here. Until next time.